We may have a few walk in at the last minute, but I want to go ahead and be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll get the meeting started. As we do, I'd like to open up the floor for public comment. Anyone who'd like to come up and speak, we're opening the door now. Anyone first? Mr. Kite, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, my name is John Kite. I live here in Bernie now. I just wanted to ask you if y'all had any questions for the letter I sent you.
I don't think I've received a letter, Mr. Kite. Who did you send it to?
I sent it to the city secretary.
Okay.
And she's supposed to distribute it to y'all, did she?
No, sir, I haven't seen it. I can ask after it, but I've not seen it.
Well,
It would make it a lot easier if we could talk about it if we'd seen it.
would you like me to read it to you?
That'd be great if you got it handy.
Yeah, hold on, let me get it.
Yes.
I think Pam's got it. Okay, hold on.
Mr. Kite, when was that sent? Just out of curiosity.
Do what?
When was it sent?
January the 20th.
Okay, so it's been-
Friday at 3:40.
She emailed me back that she had sent it out to everybody.
Maybe it went to council and not
Can you
us.
see that, Tommy? I don't.
See it on.
Could I ask her to send it to y'all?
Well, somebody has it. I don't have it, Mr. Kite, but you're here and you got the letter. So if you don't mind, please read it.
Okay, well, it's a little long, but.
Well,
Okay.
We got a little while.
Okay, it went to the chair and committee members. The planning committee work efforts will soon be completed in reaching their goals of identifying water conservation potentials, protecting existing water sources, exploring potential new water sources, including reclaimed water, and keying your findings to long-term strategic planning for responsible economic growth. Can I sit down and read this, y'all?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. If we can still hear you, that'll be just fine with me. Or someone else can read it for you if you
Oh,
prefer.
well, you can do that.
Let somebody else read it for them.
If somebody wants to read it.
Milan, you want to read that for me? Is that you okay?
But I have problem with balance.
Yes, sir. Mr. Kite, was there, in addition to the letter, is there anything else you want to say, or would you like to address it after the letter's read?
When he gets through reading, if y'all got questions.
Very good. Thanks, sir.
Okay.
Juan Michaelek, standing in for John Kite. Big shoes to fill, but I'll go ahead and read anyway. It's addressed to the chair and committee members. The planning committee's work efforts will soon be completed in reaching their goals of identifying water conservation potentials, protecting existing water sources, exploring potential new water sources, including reclaimed water, and keying your findings to the long-term strategic planning for responsible economic growth to sustain a high quality of life in Kendall County in the city of Bernie. There are several comments I would like to offer concerning the committee's use of the term firm yield, and it's quote unquote, as related to available water supplies to service future population growth. The definition of firm yield is the quote maximum water volume a reservoir can provide each year under a repeat drought of record, unquote, which is almost the same as another quote beginning with safe yield, the annual amount of water that can be withdrawn from a reservoir for a period of time longer than the drought of record, unquote. The other key water definition is availability. Quote, maximum amount of water available during the drought of record, regardless of whether the supply is physically or legally available, unquote. What this means is that when you use quote unquote firm yield as a planning tool to justify water availability supplies to meet future population growth water demands, you are missing the meaning of physical or legal availability. With the storage capacity of Canyon Lake and Bernie City Lake, and considering the current and future water demands, there won't be any water available during a repeat drought of record. GBRA has a mandatory curtailment plan in place, as I hope the city does for City Lake, to reduce the average monthly water use based on lake levels. This is where using firm yield goes astray, since in a severe drought, there may be no water available. What plans has the committee to offer for this eventuality? Is it going to be exceedingly hard to enforce any mandatory curtailments on water users during periods of drought conditions? The 50s drought was bad, but a repeat would be devastating to Kendall County due to the fact that we have a population more than 10 times greater with a lifestyle not in tune to conservation of water, with an excessive water demand not comparable to the rural nature back then. With a few below average rainfall years, the storage capacities of both groundwater and surface water reservoirs would be compromised and subject to rapid depletion. Have any thoughts been given to the committee to such an eventuality? Has the committee investigated overlaying a 5-year drought period into a 50-year planning cycle? The committee should investigate evaluating various levels of mandatory water restrictions to determine what level of population could be supported with the water supplies available during various degrees of drought of record conditions. By using only firm yield water supplies, the resulting data is misleading by implying that adequate, unlimited supply of water will be perpetually available to meet the population's water demands. Firm yield only occurs when there is adequate rainfall to meet existing water demands with or without a surplus. The committee's final report should not be based on full use of a firm yield figure to justify future population sustainability, but based on lesser amounts based on years that do not provide firm yield water supply conditions. This way, short semi-drought conditions can be dealt with using water stored from past years of plenty. One should never plan on using the maximum available resources, but should always maintain some resources in reserve for unseen events requiring additional water. In other words, base future water supply needs to meet population growth on 75% of an adjusted firm yield calculation, not on a 100% of a theoretical firm yield. Our city and county would become ghost towns without a dependable supply of water during repeat drought of record. Another issue that has been discussed by the committee is the treatment of reclaimed domestic or municipal wastewater into direct potable reuse, indirect potable reuse, direct non-potable reuse, or indirect non-potable reuse to supplement our future water supplies. There are successful examples across the state which show that the systems work. Bernie needs to invest in an expandable pilot plant now to prepare to meet its future needs rather than waiting until the need arises. Then it's too late, since it requires design time, construction time, and money to get such a system online and functioning. This has been brought up before, but like many good proposals, it sits on the shelf gathering dust with nothing being done in meeting Bernie's future water needs. It's going to be expensive, but if you want water, that's what it'll cost. GBRA water will be out of this world expensive also. Bernie could use data and results discovered by other trailblazers in the water recycling efforts to develop a system of our own more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively, and more cost effective to help in our assurance of meeting our future water demands. Again, most of the issues discussed by this committee are not new, but are issues that have been previously discussed, with reports put on the shelf and forgotten. No actions taken. In the future, we are all going to wish we had acted on what we all knew would happen sooner or later with population growth and water availability, but sat on our hands and did nothing. We are sitting on the edge of a desert with limited availability of water that won't safely support continued population expansions or even what we currently have under drought conditions. The committee needs to include a review of events that address various scenarios to see what the population is sustainable under different levels of drought conditions. What conservation efforts and mandatory enforcement rules would be in place to fairly distribute what available resources maintain. Over the years, there have been a failure of number of studies, Over the years, there have been a number of studies, including the Region L State Water Plan, delving into future population growth, future water demands, and future water resources to make us aware to prepare our future water shortages. We need to recognize the implications of these studies and take action while we still have time on our side. There is no forgiveness for our inaction to a known problem. We all will suffer one way or another. In conclusion, it appears that most of the committee members lack knowledge in the design requirements for a water study, such as this one, and are dependent on results based simply on taking the firm yield quantity and dividing it by gallons per capita per day to see what population amount that water would support. It doesn't take into consideration what effect a drought of any severity would have on the sustainability of the population derived from the above simple formula, which supports high density growth with no fallback on what happens when the firm yield is depleted and no longer exists. Last paragraph. It appears the committee needs to engage the services of an accredited engineering firm knowledgeable of this type of water study to provide the committee with guidance on water resources and availability, including during periods of drought of record conditions, correlating projected population growth with available water resources and population sustainability, along with some recommendations on water use rules or mandates during periods of drought conditions. With the data provided by the selected engineering firm, the committee would have the benefit of understanding how a sustainable population can be achieved based on a reliable water resources, along with what conservation measures must be implemented by the city during periods of drought. The end result will be a population figure considerably less than predicted by the current method of calculating now, but one that is based on a reliable and sustainable supply of water. With this accomplished, the committee can then move forward with its long-term strategic planning agenda for responsible economic growth to sustain a high quality of life in Kendall County and City of Bernie. Respectfully, John C. Kite.
Thank you, Milan, for reading that. All right. Anybody have questions of Mr. Kite at this point? I know we'll be talking about this some a little later on. Mr. Kite, is there anything you want to add at this time?
All this isn't new to me. I served on the state water plan for 19 years. And a lot of these same questions I'm presenting to y'all, I presented there. And one of the questions I asked Bill West, who was in charge at that time, was, will Canyon Lake ever run out of water? Yes. He said, it will, but theoretically, the next day it's going to start raining. Well, that's great. But imagine, well, first of all, look at how they figure the firm yield on Canyon Lake right now. There's a lot of people that are first in time for the water. So they get the water. The electric power plant gets the water. The trout fishermen, they get the water. So it goes down a whole list of things, and they look at the input, so many cubic feet a second into the reservoir. Okay, let's imagine that it does go dry. How many years is it going to take to fill up? Because you know what's going to happen. As soon as water starts filling up in the reservoir, they're going to start selling it. So unless you get a gigantic rain, I mean, like we had a couple of times, 30 some odd inches in a day, the reservoir is not going to fill up very quick. So you're going to be stuck with no water for a long time. And that's what I'm saying. Y'all need to look at how much population can you actually support with a drought of record conditions. And again, you got to remember in the 50s, there wasn't but 5,000 people here. And they were mostly rural people. They didn't have these watered yards. And, you know, something that always aggravates me is to see the walk-in bathtubs. They use 50 or 60 gallons of water for one bath. That's ridiculous. So anyhow, we just need to be realistic in looking at what we're proposing. And you can't just take the firm yield, which is a theoretical thing to start with, and divide it by the use per day per person and come up with people. That won't work. You need to have more realistic view, and you need to have rules on how you're going to manage doing a drought record. Because right now, if you were to lay a drought record on us, I don't know that we could sustain it even with what we got now. So anyhow, all I'm saying is y'all need to do some looking and get some realistic figures out and realistic rules on managing drought. So if y'all got any questions other than that, I'll be glad to answer them.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kite. Anyone?
Well, so the city did that, you know, the HCR, they hired HCR to do an assessment. Did you pay attention to that assessment?
I can't hear you.
The city hired a firm called the acronym is HDR to assess the water supply for at least the city of Bernie. Did you by chance pay attention to that?
HDR has been involved in too many water studies, and they've got their mind pretty much made up when they come to you. I'd like to see you get somebody that's different, maybe, that may have a little different perspective. I don't know. Some of y'all may know HDR, but I know they were involved in the regional water planning group for years. You just need to look at it as what's really going to happen if we have all this population and no water or very little water. How are you going to manage it? So
I think an important takeaway from what John's saying is, and when we talk about total water, there's a hierarchy of use. There's those non-discretionary uses you have to have for basic human health and safety and sanitation. And then there's all the discretionary uses. We look at overall water budgets, we typically look at the macro number. And during a time of drought, all that really genuinely should be served from a policy standpoint or a practical standpoint of those non-discretionary uses. There's also a fiscal reality that goes with that. When you're managing a utility and you're selling water and you have certain income streams to serve your employees in the maintenance of the system and bonded indebtedness and all those things. So in advance of having to address any of those problems, my takeaway from what John's saying is, number one, let's get you some real numbers. And one of those policy decisions and those ordinance decisions, you have that hierarchy the city has or the groundwater district has in terms of triggering drought reductions. Let's figure those things out before you have to do it. So proactively rather than reactively. And so I know everyone has a drought plan of some shape or form. And I think it's probably a good time to take a critical look at that individually and collectively and say, hey, we've taken these assumptions. Let's challenge our assumptions. And that's what John's asking us to do, is challenge those assumptions. Let's challenge them a little bit. And, I'd hate to be, COVID sprang upon us, but it was a good lesson in were we prepared for the unexpected? No, we responded and we responded well, some better than others, but we weren't prepared for the unexpected. Drought is eventually going to happen. The only unexpected portion of it is when. And so what are our plans for dealing with that when it comes here? And what's the realistic number in terms of when you're taking on additional water use? So, that's.
well, yeah, I don't know. Some of you know, maybe you don't all know, but where I lived before living in town, I lived on the hill north of here. We had a rainwater system. We didn't have a well. And our average, you talk about average use, 100 and something gallons a day. Well, where that comes from is you're taking all the water and dividing it by the people, but you're lumping into that all the schools, all the businesses, everything. The actual use per person per day in a residence is not a whole lot. We averaged about 35 gallons a day per person. And when I did design work on it, I used 50 gallons a day, which we never got close to. So really, the amount of water you really need, if you want to get down to bare roots, you can get by with 5 gallons a day. Now, you're not taking a shower. That's bare minimum. But if you design for 35 or 50 gallons a day and some outside water, you don't need much water, but none of that's taken into consideration in all your planning. So all I'm saying is, get realistic on what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
I'd also like to get realistic on getting a knee replaced one time.
All right, who else would like to come up and make comment? Alex, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. Alex Rudd, Kendall County. I'm going to move quickly. I'm going to try to cover this as quickly as possible. First of all, I agree with diversification, conservation, planning. I also believe firmly that most of the residents of this community are very intelligent and reasonable. Not necessarily a no growth versus paved paradise crowd, but we know that there's a need for economic growth and development and a healthy economy in Bernie. However, my perception is even more enforced now than ever that a crucial element is missing. That is caution. That somehow, perhaps it's not this committee, but there is just the desire for more water for continued unlimited growth. I want to take a look at the news in Arizona. I'm sure most of you have probably seen it. Recently, very recently, Governor Hobbs made an announcement that the 2023 water report with the predictions for supply is predicting a 4 million acre foot deficit. Just last year in December, there was a lot of news about a developer planning 100,000 homes near Scottsdale. This developer was absolutely convinced that there was a 100-year supply of water underground, and conservation would make this community possible, bringing nearly 1 million people to the area. This is consistent with decades of unlimited sprawl in the southwestern desert. At the same time, late last year, Scottsdale was announcing that it no longer had water to spare for trucked-in deliveries to 500 homes in a nearby community. They would be cut off, and currently they have been. There's a lawsuit pending, and other communities are very much afraid that they're next. They're about to lose trucked-in water. This is 500 homes. A major city doesn't have trucked-in water for 500 houses. There's a big disconnect here. The announcement from Governor Hobbs acknowledged a curveball has been sent. This is completely unexpected, and it completely conflicts with decades of urban sprawl that was apparently supported because they weren't going to have any water problems. Suddenly, everything's changed, and now they're acknowledging that the combined impact of a 1,000-year mega drought, combined with decades of urban sprawl and uncontrolled growth, motivated by economic desires and desires to increase their population, is no longer sustainable. And she has acknowledged this, and she has acknowledged the role of climate change in changing this formula, and now they have a crisis. The question I have is, obviously they have hydrologists and experts that are intelligent, well-trained, just like we do in Texas. Why was this not seen years ago? How could it be that just last year, late last year, everything was going to be okay, they could plan through it, and now suddenly it's not? There's question that the prior administration did not want to reveal this report, but my perception is still very clear that something changed very quickly, and their predictions that they had for many years were not infallible. We are equally vulnerable to this curveball from a combination of climate change, increased population, and the prediction that this area will become increasingly arid as the megadrought spreads to the east, and we may be looking at bigger areas with permanent desert. We may be seeing a situation in the future, unexpectedly, where a drought of record in the 1950s is no longer a reliable benchmark. We had a brief preview of this in 2022, where relatively quickly our rivers disappeared. If this happened and it lasted 5, 6, 7 years, I think we would have an unprecedented catastrophe in this state. The drought of record is not a reliable benchmark. Unfortunately, the Texas Water Development Board refuses to acknowledge climate change. And they have been criticized for failure to do that. And they have been warned the drought of record, it could be completely overtaken by something far, far worse. Can we honestly say that we can sustain unlimited development and safely use these benchmarks and assume that unlimited growth can be supported? I say not. Firm yield is not a guarantee. It's a paper promise. Far more complex than finding more water is that caution needs to be included and sustainable growth is part of this. Unfortunately, this is politically unacceptable and politics trump common sense. I find this to be, I'm going to use this word, not directed at you, it's ridiculous. And again, that's not to this committee, it's to our state legislature. Statewide, there's much evidence of a lack of coordination. We have a proliferation of municipal utility districts and WCIDs that are solely now serving developers. At the first meeting of this water committee, I watched the video and a discussion was made of the Travis County municipal districts, some of them using 400% or more of the average per capita use. These are shrouded in secrecy. They have no limits to their use, and even tracking what they're using is extremely difficult. There's no cooperation from our TCEQ. WCIDs are also a problem. They're proliferating. We just had another one here in Bernie. This is creating a thinning of a limited resource. There's a big disconnect statewide and locally. San Antonio is so eager to maintain their image of water abundance, and this has been confirmed to draw in more industry. They don't want industry to come in to visit and see brown lawns. They kept weekly lawn watering from borrowed water through Vista Ridge, while other Edwards Aquifer users were put on stage 4 restrictions, and entire communities elsewhere in this region had no drinking water at all. Right now, the question is, what can we do? Local leadership needs to acknowledge and accept that there are vast uncertainties of the future. Climate change is going to throw us a curveball and unexpected challenges, and these could be far worse. If 2022 lasted 2, 3, 5 years, I don't even want to think about what this area would look like. Certainly, if the rivers stop flowing, they're going to stop feeding Canyon Lake. If it gets hot enough, long enough, Canyon Lakes and other reservoirs are going to evaporate. Sustainable growth is the missing factor in this equation. It's essential to future planning, and the political bias needs to stop. We also need to include protecting groundwater quality in our planning, because we can't afford to pollute a limited resource, especially in our karst region. Local leadership, including our Bernie leadership, our commissioners court, and citizens, need to challenge the unreasonable expectations of a state legislature that currently supports unlimited growth that cannot be supported without enormous risk to our future and our future generations. Immediately, I'm going to make an additional note. I had a long conversation at our last meeting about pollution. I would like to see action taken on the pending Buc-ee's. This would go a long way to building public confidence in our leadership. This needs to happen before the project is built, and we need to make certain that these protective measures are taken, or at least that they're addressed. I haven't heard anything about this. This includes recommendations of Dr. Venny, the fuel storage tank reinforcements, and contractually mandated filtration systems that are specific to the contamination risk, properly maintained and monitored, including filter changes when necessary. If these systems are put in and they're not maintained, they are useless. There is no reason why this simple request, and this is one of many steps that need to be taken, there's no reason why this cannot be addressed now by our local leadership. I would be very upset and frustrated to see this enormous 100 pump gas station be constructed without even having this mentioned. It's just one step of many we need to take to protect our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Anyone else?
Good morning again. I'm Mike, 12 Grant Road. I live out in the county beyond the ETJ city of Bernie. I wanted to depart from my normal researching activities and get away from hydrology and geology and politics and you name it, anything associated with water. And I just kind of want to speak off the cuff today. As many of y'all know, I'm retired Air Force. I'm a career aircraft maintainer. I've taken care of airplanes, fleet size, focused on sustainability. And after I retired from the Air Force in 2001, I took on a new job with the DoD, basically doing the same job I did on active duty. And I'm involved in an acquisition program to replace a fleet of airplanes that were first delivered at Randolph, 1961, the T-38. The point is that I've had to evolve considerably over multiple decades. I've got almost 50 years of experience in aircraft maintenance. When I was an E-1 pounding the flight line at Randolph, I didn't know nothing about keeping fleets going for long periods of time. Similarly, as I've gotten into water, 2004 timeframe, and again, thanks to Tommy's mentorship, begin to understand whole pictures and advanced systems engineering, systems level engineering. And I'm not an engineer, but I can read. What I'm trying to talk to you about is advancing, which is very difficult for me, change. That's why I wanted to talk about real quickly. I attended a very intensive Department of Defense maintenance symposium about a month ago. And all throughout the symposium, there was a tremendous amount of activity generated from not only the DoD, but also private industry, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, and developing a predictive maintenance capability. Through collection of data, through systems-based algorithms on the sensors that are on the aircraft, determine when is the best time to change parts before they fail. Well, we do that now. We call it time changes. We know a pump lasts 600 hours in flight. Well, this type of data gathering, processing, and distribution amongst maintainers on a fleet-wide level provides an opportunity to actually prevent unscheduled maintenance. And I thought it was pie in the sky. Delta, through an operation they call Delta Tech Ops, virtually eliminated unscheduled maintenance in their aircraft fleet. Because for them, the bottom line is the bottom line. If they have an airplane that's broke, it don't carry passengers and sits in a queue waiting for parts. Well, they have parts delivered to the airplane that's been determined through sensor-based algorithm management. I need this part at this period of time, and I'll deliver it here. The airplane lands, change the part, it's back in the system. So this works. And this all goes back to a theme of relevancy. There was a 4-star Army general back in the 2001, 2003 timeframe, who's chief of staff of the Army, General Shinseki. And he attributed to a really good quote: "If you dislike change, you're going to dislike irrelevance even more." And I'm laying this out for me personally. I'm striving to be relevant, and I'm being drugged into the digital age. And I don't mean just digitalization. I don't mean just scanning documents and putting them in the system. I'm talking about sensor-based information that we have access to today. The Cow Creek's got monitor wells that record data real time. The USGS similarly, streamflow data. I know the city works really hard to collect data. It's flowing in, literally flowing faster than we can do anything with. And I want to urge the committee to consider not just looking at digitalization, not looking at taking advantage of what can be digitized, but analyze data to develop a predictive capability, so we don't have to be reactive. In maintenance, one of the biggest problems I've had to overcome is focused on lagging indicators, things that happened 30 days ago. Now I have to focus on things that are happening right now by the hour, and not by one thing, dozens, hundreds, thousands of things. So I urge the committee to consider advancing into the digital age. I haven't heard much of it talked about because I really didn't know much about it, to be honest with you. So I'm in the same forest trying to walk through this. So again, thank you for all your time so far, all the effort, all the study, all the conversations, and for listening to people like me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Are there any other public comments? Anyone on the Zoom call? Don't see anyone with a raised hand. So we'll move into the discussion items. On the agenda, and if you don't have one, there are a few extra on the end of the dais there. Subsection A is just a summary of the discussion points, and it's really included for purposes of a look back on last meeting and the comments that were sort of that I heard, and I'd like everyone to take a look at them at their leisure to see if there's something that's missing or something that they think is inaccurate. That way we can try to fine tune those points a little bit before we start drafting and not waste time unnecessarily when it comes to putting these thoughts together. So that's really the purpose of those. I don't intend to go through them again at this point, but meant to serve as a reminder to what ground we've covered and what my understanding was from covering that ground. Moving to subsection B, and these are in no particular order. We've already started scratching the surface on some of these, but Tommy and Kurt brought up a variety of different things in their letter before last meeting, and we didn't get the chance to cover those in any great detail. And some of them we had talked around a little bit before, some not as much, but I didn't want to move forward trying to put together a report of any kind without addressing these, make sure we got comment on them and exercise a little further thought. So the first on the list is the water grid. We've talked essentially from day one about interconnectivity, the lack of it, and the value for it and of it. So I want to open the floor for further discussion there. See if we can identify potential partners. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. Good idea, bad idea, what the steps involved might be, that sort of thing.
And I'd love to hear from, our utility experts about the challenges of creating that interconnectivity. Both the physical engineering and policy and political challenge, legislative challenges. So I'd like to volunteer Mr. Mike Mann. I know he and I have talked about it before. It's been many a moon passed since then, but.
Sure. I mean, bottom line is it gets down, and please speak up if you have any other comments. It gets down to perspective. Typically the interconnectivity looks really good from the perspective of the small guy adjacent to the big guy that can see those big guys as a water source. In some cases, we're the big guy, in some cases, we're the small guy. But each utility has to be responsible to its ratepayers. And just, and I can tell you, if as a utility, if you start making water available to folks, then that they might start to use that as a crutch. And what you do for one, you kind of have to do for all. Can't be arbitrary. And so, for instance, if we were to interconnect with SAWS, which we have discussed, they do have a policy for that. It's supposed to be emergency use only, not a water supply. And I would say the same thing. My concern with other area utilities when we were asked in the past is, hey, we need to interconnect so we can back each other up. Well, it didn't feel symbiotic. It felt more like y'all can back us up in case we need you. Now, whether that was true or not, that's kind of how it felt. And I'm sure that that's how SAWS feels about all the smaller utilities around them. Interconnectivity is great from a standpoint of keeping pressure in the system. It's not a water supply. Now, when it comes to one water utility acting as a wholesale purveyor to another, that kind of interconnectivity is a good thing and could be.
Right.
Where you could have a regional water supply, maybe wheel water through your system from a source to another utility, and those kind of things each utility should have a rate for or has a rate for. Again, it's about being fiscally responsible to your ratepayers and making sure your ratepayers aren't funding, development of another system. Legally, I'm not even going to speak to the Edwards Aquifer Authority. I don't understand it the way SAWS does, but there are some boundary lines you can't cross sometimes. And in our case, it's in the case of SAWS, serving outside of Bear County is an issue, especially on a long-term basis. So there's those kind of things that I don't even have to deal with daily. We tend to look locally at our demand. The question for this committee has been from the beginning, if we do need more water, where do we get it?
Right.
And I think that's, and policy issues aside, that has been the challenge over the years, because the bottom line is we just don't know what other regional projects are out there yet. In the mid 1990s, we didn't know about GBRA's Western Canyon project, whereas in 1998, it was the future of our water. And so as we go forward, interconnectivity, conservation, all of those kind of tools that we can use should all be in the toolkit. The question is, if the region needs more water, where does it come from? Now, the ace in the hole is always drought restrictions. And speakers that were up earlier and talking about landscaping are right. I mean, that's not new information. A lot of our water goes on lawns, And in a repeat of the drought of record, we probably won't be able to let our customers irrigate the way they're used to, nor may they want to. They may not want to pay for it. Those are things that are arrows in the quiver, if you will, to use to manage in short-term consumption. But as the state of Texas continues to grow and people continue to move in, that base flow needs to be met. And I feel like we have a long-term availability of base flow, the water needed for human life, including showering and bathing. We have an ample supply of that. What we are challenged with every year is how to meet irrigation needs. And so what this committee did and we have been doing historically is promoting conservation to try to minimize that summertime peak. And that helps not only with the year to year, month to month production versus demand, but it also helps with planning. The less you peak for, the less you have to decide you need to go out and find. So I'm telling Noah about the flood again, but I think those are things that we tend to forget until we remind ourselves. And it's good that the public's educating themselves on these issues, but they are policy issues. And so the policymakers do control a lot of that. A lot of the water consumption demand in the region is being driven by state legislature created water districts that we have to regionally figure out how to provide for. And so the question is, do we provide for them, or do we let another utility provide for them and possibly negatively affect our water supply? You know, if we can control their water use, should we provide for them? Those are the decisions that our policymakers have to make locally based on policy that is implemented at the state level. So I went a lot farther down that road than you probably intended, but
No,
on the
it was a great
interconnectivity
answer.
topic,
It was a great
that's
answer.
kind of how the way it works. Sometimes it feels like we're trying to serve people, but really what we're trying to do is manage both growth and demand of water.
Well, I echo most everything Mike just said. I think he hit the nail on the head with a lot of that. And, you know, the word water grid has a connotation. Interconnectivity has kind of another connotation. That's where the distinction between emergency interconnects versus a regional water supply. And there are plenty of regional water supplies around. You guys have some, they're Alliance, and there's several regional water projects. All of those are good and they work out, and especially when smaller and medium communities come together and put those projects together. For us, you know, we had the former BareMet entity in San Antonio, and they were using us, just as Mike pointed out, to as a water supply. Essentially, they would use us during summertime to meet their peak demand, and that was penalizing to us. We'd gone out and planned and spent money and all of that, and so that was frustrating for us at the time. We ultimately they went away. We had to increase our costs on them and all that, but that interconnectivity can become, as long as it is a symbiotic relationship where you're planning for another supply and you've got it all planned, both parties are participating. I think all that works out. All of the planning efforts, again, I echo a lot of what Mr. Kite and others said about, you can't just plan for whatever drought of record is. All of these supplies, there are a multitude of things you've got to include in there. And I think we've got a lot of that. I think we talked about some of the political implications and the realistic scenarios. And so I think all of that is true. So, the term water grid, again, has almost a negative connotation to a lot of people, but I think particularly when you get to state leaders who think, you're changing your model and now you're trying to become this water grid operator. But so I would, if we're going to say anything, I would say it's regional projects are where you go. But interconnectivity, again, as we've talked many, many times about, we do from SAWS, that's the most logical sort of interconnectivity. We've got our legal challenges there. we also have planning challenges, again, as other people have talked about from a, climate change, population increase, conservation, all of those things. We put those all into the model and it does stress your models quite a bit. And so we have to decide, do we really have enough water to go forward? Particularly to sell to another entity. And so all of that goes into that planning effort. So I like interconnectivity, but you get back to some of these political and legal challenges with each project that we've got kind of listed above.
So interconnectivity making sense, emergency situation, and if you're moving wholesale water.
Yes.
Okay. Put a big X through the word grid. Daryl, you do stuff on a pretty broad scale from the coast to the hills.
We do. I mean, I agree with Donovan. A water grid, really what water grid means is you're taking some of these projects that are above listed in A, and it's a combined multiple community effort developing those projects. That's water grid. And that's how a water supply would be as a water supply. For interconnectivity, that's for emergency use. It's not a water supply. But like Donovan said, that it's hard for communities right now to develop local supplies because most of the local supplies have been developed. It is more expensive to move water from where it is to where it is needed. Texas does have ample water supply. It's just not in the locations that it's needed. And it does require a water grid. It does require multiple communities working together to do that. Conservation is the last, that's one of the things this group tackled early on, conservation, because that is the best option. That also helps you identify what your water demands are going to be needing, what your water demands would be in the future, both on a basic base flow level, and it also helps shape policy when you're looking at, what are your options? Do you change policy in the local community to try to get those peak numbers down to reduce your water supply that is needed in the future as well?
I have a technical question, a little bit off subject, but I think somewhat germane. In a system, Mike, in your system, you've got to maintain a certain line pressure for DCEQ from a health standpoint. How about in a transmission system? Is it the same line pressure standard, or what are the standards for that?
So as long as you're not serving retail connections off of that line, and then you have a lower pressure you can maintain in that line.
Okay.
So, in some of our wholesale facilities, it's transmission only. We require customers to take delivery through an air gap in a storage tank, so it's not pressure. We're not maintaining any pressure in their system, and we're not allowed to serve anybody off of that system. So we're able to maintain lower pressure. That can help with your pump, your sizing of your pumps, because you're maintaining more of a steady state flow. It also can help in your choice selection of pipe. You can get a lower pressure rated pipe. So it can help a little bit on the cost side as well.
So when we talk about interconnectivity from an emergency standpoint, would we envision something like that same air gap setup, or would it be direct connect? I mean, I'm just thought out for you guys to kick around.
Well, so it depends on how permanent the connection is, probably is the best way to put it. I'll speak in terms of bulk water. I mean, if you want to take it from utility scale to local scale. When we allow a contractor to hook up and when water is available, take potable water for construction purposes, we require them to use a backflow preventer. It's required by TCEQ, it's required by the utility, and it's a good idea. If they are a permanent hookup, then we would rather they take it through an air gap, a separation between the tank and the pipe, because that is the best way to make sure you don't have any cross contamination. Water doesn't flow the other way.
Right.
If you're doing it on a temporary basis, then maintaining an air gap is really not feasible. Utility to utility on a temporary basis, you're really talking about taking water through a meter, almost like a service. Whereas if you've got a wholesale water supply, you take that through an air gap by contract. So Temporary use, I would say something mechanical more than likely, just because the costs are are so great to provide an air gap that's protected from the environment inside a tank for something that you would use incrementally just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Now, if it's your water supply, sure, it's going into a tank 24/7, you take it through an air gap, it helps keep the water pure, all those kind of things.
But that becomes unidirectional, one way.
Mhm.
So,
It all is. I mean, every backflow preventer is intended to keep the water flowing from one direction, in one direction. Utilities do not share water back and forth in general. It all flows in one direction.
whereas in a grid, it would flow to the.
Right,
direction
and you
the
have to
grid
worry
receives.
about each other's water quality. So, there are, and it's not just about contamination, it's also about production. When you produce groundwater, in our area, it's harder water, but it's easier to treat. If you produce surface water, it's a lot more difficult to treat, it's softer, but there's disinfection byproducts that you have to treat for. And so, and as that water ages, that problem gets worse. So the detention time in your system becomes an issue. And if water's flowing on in some kind of great big grid back and forth like it does locally, then we would worry about our production sources and who's getting the good water and who's getting the bad.
The experience in Flint, Michigan taught the general public what the utility community already knew is that when you blend water of different chemistries or you change it, it has a consequence and it's seldom a good one. So.
And the type of disinfectant you use becomes an issue. You can get taste and odor problems. And so there are some types of water that you treat with one kind of disinfectant. There's other types that you treat with another and they don't mix. So it's just operationally, it would be tough to interconnect everything.
Well, you just have to plan for it. Again, we have 15 different water projects from 9 different sources throughout our system. And so we have a very vigorous sampling protocol, lots of different things that we're watching how each one of those water sources are mixing with the other. And it just adds to the cost. There's a lot of engineering associated with it. You got to make sure the treatment is correct. You got to make sure that when it's flowing, again, you have to avoid long detention times and things like that. It certainly can be done. It just requires a lot more activity, monitoring, and a lot of time more treatment.
Time and money.
And hiccups occur, and I'm not talking
Yeah.
about the utilities making mistakes, but for instance, Bernie City Lake, if you have a significant weather event, the incoming water quality can change dramatically overnight. And that means you have to augment your treatment. And sometimes you don't find out that it's changed until you start to see a problem and you deal with it as quickly as possible. It could be a color problem, not necessarily a health problem.
Well, and as described, you're not talking about something where you can flip a switch and make interconnectivity just button up to one another. It's going to be one direction of flow anyway. And then each one of them has to be carefully considered because you're talking about different qualities of water, different treatment systems, so on and so forth. So even under the best of circumstances, it's very complicated. and
Well,
probably very
being
expensive.
in the industry that we are also in power, I can talk about the power grid. And you have a state entity that controls that because somebody has to figure out who gets paid to produce versus who uses. And there's a very complicated system that they use and it's prone to hiccups.
Yes.
And so right now we kind of still protect ourselves locally from a water supply versus water consumption standpoint. I think that the whole deregulation of the electric industry purpose was good. That was to be cost control, especially for those that were getting high costs in the Metroplex or investor owned areas. But the downside to it is it kind of throws us all into one big pool that can affect us all in ways we used to be able to protect ourselves from. And the same thing could happen with water if we tried to interconnect.
And you could certainly go both ways. It just, again, sometimes lawyers are your friends, sometimes engineers are your friends. They're always all our friends.
And sometimes they're even friends.
Most times now.
Sometimes.
Most times now.
As a layperson, I take this. This is something to the extent we would recommend it to council or suggest it as a possibility. It would be on a very discrete basis.
Right.
And with clearly identified neighbors or partners for very specific purposes, because anything else would just simply won't work. that a fair summary?
Unless the neighbors would enter into a wholesale agreement.
Yeah, unless you're looking for that as a supply source. And then again, that's a different animal. And that's really more covered in the earlier conversations we had as opposed to the emergency concept.
Although the GBRA project, I don't know if that would be considered a project, almost, again, similar to that. I don't know if that's an accurate description, but I think that's already covered because the GBRA project's not going to be lower basin only to Bernie. It's going to be a lot of different.
A lot of places. Yeah, it's more of a grid, but I guess you're going to account for that as it comes to you, right? So there'll be iterations as it comes down the line, right? But it'll be treated as a wholesale source from that standpoint because it won't be flowing backwards, right? Other thoughts or comments on the interconnectivity water grid concept thought? All right. Drum yield, very popular subject today. So this is something we've often talked about, but we really have never delved into because I don't think anybody's had the resources to go find out the answer to the question, what is our drought of record and its impact on our usage at this point in time. We, at least if we have those numbers, I haven't seen them and have them modeled out. So I think that's been talked about as something that would be nice to have so that you can say, what is our worst case scenario? Or in as much as we think we can come up with what the worst case scenario is outside of we completely run out of water. What for a layperson, what's involved in getting an appropriate amount of data together to try to come up with something workable? I mean, do you simply hire an engineer and say, hey, we want to know this and here are the parameters we're looking at? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, we're looking at a couple different water for Bernie and Kendall County. We're looking at a handful of water sources. And so, you know, the comments that Kurt and I threw this on here for discussion was, you know, how do we predict what those are going to be? We can look at the MAG numbers from the groundwater availability models, the GAM. That doesn't tell us a drought of record conditions. You know, we're in a priority groundwater management area. We've been so for 30 years, 30 plus years, because there's prediction water shortages on a groundwater standpoint here, just basic normal consumption. So I think it's worthwhile to go in and look at those models and those assumptions and say, what would they be? The HDR report greatly discounts the availability of groundwater from the city's well system, you know, during a repeat of a significant drought. So, you know, Mike and I've talked about that too. That number where they're permitted here becomes a drop in the bucket. It's a fraction, significant fraction of what we're counting as supply. I think it'd be good to just sit down and have an engineer that's going to go through and look at all those things. I know Kurt mentioned to me that the Region L is looking at even longer droughts than the drought of record in terms of planning. I think in order to make recommendations to the city, it ought to be that we ought to have somebody that's skilled in that. They need to spend some money and have that done for each one of the water supplies, whether it be, I would break it into what the current supplies are and then what these recommendations might, if they adopt any of these recommendations, what they might be. So, you know, there'll be resources to draw from, obviously from SAWS or from GBRA. They have some of that data. They use some of the same engineering firms. You know, both of y'all use HDR at different times, right? You know, that, and they've been involved in the process. You know, maybe they're the right firm. Maybe it's someone else to look over the shoulder of all that's already been done. Maybe you want an independent third person to look, or fourth person to look over that. But I think it'd be really good to sit down and say, all right, what's our worst case scenario?
I agree with that. I got a question for, and I think I've asked you this before, Donovan, but you know, you said SAWS factors in climate change into its planning. How is it doing that? And that's my first question.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that a little bit. So in our plans, we put in the drought of record from the 50s at that time frame, and what that did in terms of Edwards Aquifer cutbacks and some of the cutbacks that we expect out of some of the supplies. but we've added additional, the intensity of the drought of 2011 through 2015. And so the rainfall, that will cause and how we put it into the numbers of the plan are additional cutbacks that we would assume through, again, the Edwards Aquifer primarily. That's our biggest supply. And so we'll be into restrictions more often, so that will reduce our supplies. So that intensity and the drought of record, we put them together into one, and that's to reflect climate change. We're going through the water management planning process. I think I gave a presentation a little bit about that. We did hire WSP as a consultant for climate change, and the data is it's evolving. I'll just say it that way. It is very difficult to predict. The models that are in place are not in good enough shape to be able to say today what climate change is going to be 30 years from now. It's definitely evolving process. So you're not going to be able to hire somebody and get the answer. You will get an answer. It'll be an expensive answer, and it will be an incorrect answer. It's going to require more modeling over time. I think that's still going to be evolving. And so that the way we have done it again is by putting in that extra layer of drought. And we think that accurately reflects, at least going forward, or at least from what we know today. Again, that's why we plan every day. That's why we plan every 5 years, constantly updating that model to do it.
Is that done internally, Donovan, or
Sorry?
is that done internally, or do you use third parties to do that, or?
The drought of record scenario, we've done that all internally, including the additional 2011 to 2015. And then we did hire WSP as the consultant to try to get some more information and try to predict long-term for the climate change models. Again, it's just going to be difficult to actually plug that into hard numbers into the plan. We also, I'm sorry, I know you're about to say something. The other thing I would say is just through experience. One of the things we were thinking of wrapping up the water management plan last year through the end of the year, but we've been going through this extreme drought now, and we got a lot of, we talked about a little bit about challenging your assumptions. We got a lot of different information about how our customers reacted last year and seeing how they're going to react in this year. And so we've got a few things going on, but I think we're pushing off the time frame so that we learn as we go. And so we're actually seeing higher spikes in water use during those first year, what you would expect, but even higher than what we had planned for. So we're going to be able to use some of that real-time data also to plug in what we think will change our customers' behavior. And so that plugs into the numbers game of demand versus supply in our plan.
When you look at that data, are you looking at it from the standpoint of this drought of record, worst case scenario, we can do a maximum service of this number of people, or is it done differently? I mean, because I can see that maybe that's one way to look at it, but if you have a certain number of people, what are you going to do? Kick them out of town, not serve them? I mean, that doesn't seem like a realistic adjustment. You may be over in your drought of record. You may not have enough water, period. So you have to make adjustments. How do you address that? Because I don't think you can, as a practical matter, say, oh, we have 1,000, 200,000, too many people here in San Antonio, and they're just not going to get water.
Yeah,
we're going to shut the gates. I mean, I don't think as a utility provider, you have the ability to do that. So how do you account for it so that you can try to be ready?
Yeah, and so that's part of the planning process. We look at what the demographers say. Their demographers disagree with each other, by the way, just so you know, every demographer has a different planning scenarios. Some of them will plan for, will predict an extremely high population. Some of them will be moderate, and they're across the board. So we take kind of an average, not an average, but we take a couple of different models. We take the local MPO model through 2040, and then we take the state demographer from 2040 till 2070, and we put what that population would be, and that's what we put into the model. So we take someone else's demographer's models, we truth test that with what we see. A lot of these things, we actually give them the data, and ultimately it comes back to us. So some of it is a little bit of a do loop, but what we're planning for this time is the local MPO and then to the state's state demography numbers from 2040 out to 2070. And I think beyond 2070 to 2075, we have to do a trend analysis on it. We have a demographer on staff as well.
But as part of that analysis, do you look at and say, okay, based on that, we will not have enough water at current consumption? So do you use a variety of tools to solve that problem? We need more water and we need more conservation, or how do you address it?
All the above. We put that population in there. We put what our supplies are in. You plug in those drought records and the intensity. We put in also more realistic scenarios. Again, some of the things that we've talked about is that, there's modeling numbers, but there's actually what we've experienced in that supply. And so once you plug all that in, we put it in a rolling 9-year deal all the way through 2075. And we identify where those gaps are, where we don't have enough supply to meet that expected population. And then we figure out, okay, what is that supply we're going to use to fill that particular gap? So we fill what the gaps that are expected population at the time. We don't try to manipulate the population and say we need to grow at a certain level and tell the city council or whoever we need to grow at a lesser rate. We meet the goal of the city council. It's a little bit different than some cities where the water department is a part of the city. We're sort of semi-autonomous. And so there's this back and forth about who's controlling land management, who's controlling population and all that. We are supportive of the city, whatever that city's population is. We just have to make sure we have enough water and or demand management tools, conservation tools in place to do that.
SAWS is subservient to the city of San Antonio and the surrounding area. So that's the nature of the relationship. What about, Daryl, what do you see with situations where the utilities are more like they are in Bernie, where say city council or governing body takes care of both? Is it the same or different?
It's not that much different, but I mean, I think what John is, what he was talking about though is, when you're talking about planning for climate change, it's not just how that climate change is going to affect your supply. It's also, you're looking at your triggers for when you got to bring on additional supply, triggers for when you start conservation measures. So you look at, you may not be able to plan for exactly what that climate change is going to look like, how it impacts your supplies, but you start looking at how you overcome that by adjusting your other triggers for when you bring on additional supplies, or maybe you start conservation measures sooner when a supply starts getting down. So I mean, it's a combination of both when you're looking at climate change, because you can't really predict that. But you can start predicting where your triggers are for how you address that when you start seeing it.
Just become more conservative with those triggers.
Correct. So do you start implementing some limiting some outdoor water usage sooner than you had previously when certain levels are achieved in wells or at a reservoir? I mean, and you look at your triggers, you got to serve a certain population. You're predicting it's going to come online at a certain point, but when you're looking at your other supplies, you're also identifying what kind of timeline you think it takes to develop that other supply source. So when you get to a certain demand point or your supplies reduce to a certain point, where when you start seeing that gap or that difference isn't big enough, then that's when you start implementing those other supplies too. So I mean, we're planning for that, and I think that's where the cities will have to are more engaged is looking at those triggers.
Well, how about for GVRA? I mean, it sells water. That's what it does. So how does it account for this? You have a finite supply, and that is either getting larger or smaller depending on all these same factors.
So we take a look at what you do see different storm events. So we are looking at projects that will have more resiliency, and that is bringing water from other locations. That is capturing water in different ways, that is looking at ASR, storing it. So when you have those larger storm events, can you capture that water somehow, either in additional reservoirs or in underground aquifers that you can store it? But the other piece of it is, we model our scenario. Firm yield is a term. There's some of the planning groups in some communities are looking at safer yields. They are looking at other projects. So what happens if there is a drought worse than the drought of record? What are other projects that we can implement to insulate for that? One thing that we also do is we do have conservation and triggers where we start calling for communities to reduce some of their usage, to prolong our water supply. So when we have a firm yield, that firm yield does not include drought contingencies, measures or reductions that we call for communities to implement. So that's added cushion that we have built, that we build into our supplies. You know, for groundwater projects, we acquire significantly more land should the groundwater district change its rules for how much water you can capture per acre. So we take a look at, and we also work with our own modelers to take a look at what that reliability is of that aquifer as well. So it's things that we're having to take into account. We're having to take that into account as part of our habitat conservation plan too. It requires us to take a look at how we would respond and react to climate change and develop a climate model associated with that. And so those are things that we're actively looking at now too.
So is the term we would want to look at, is it more in line with safer yield than traditional firm yield? I mean, Mr. Kite brought that up. Does that seem almost like a maturing way to look at this in terms of like, okay, people are starting to up the game because, as Mrs. Red pointed out, yes, as it's been seen over and I'm curious to know what the scuttle is in your all's world in this regard, but as we've seen in Arizona with, you know, oh, we're going to be fine. Oh, whoops, we're getting scared. It seems like there's a maturation process going on in terms of what is not just firm yield, but what's the safer yield. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think, you know, whether you call it firm yield or safer yield, I think it's always taking a look at your triggers. At what point is your demand, you know, do you have other projects lined up? Should you start seeing some demand increase, or your supply is not quite be as strong as you may have thought they are? But there is, I mean, there is effort to take a look at it. But, you know, you're also having to take a look at what is the cost of planning for some of these projects. You know, most communities have planned for a firm yield, looking at the reliability. How do you cushion that? How do you, and at what cost is that? So, I mean, those are things that are tough. And if you're a utility, you know, like you know, what Donovan talked about, you got to plan for the growth that the city's had. You don't get to dictate what that growth is going to be. So you've got to be prepared and plan for that, regardless.
And then, okay, so then going back to the other question too, I don't want to derail your line of questioning, but I am curious, what's the scuttle, the response to this fiasco out in Arizona? You know, is it causing people in your all's world to talk about, you know, these topics and think differently, or are you guys saying those people were nuts and we always knew they were going to fail?
Well, what's the water cooler for?
I mean,
Both be true.
yeah.
Need to turn recorder off.
I think the approach that Texas uses with a local approach of looking at regional planning for growth and water supply availability and looking at that, I think that, you know, and that's a continuous process. Communities, larger communities and larger utilities do that individually. They do that collectively as a group in the regional planning process. I think that keeps that on the forefront. So planning wise, I think we're in better shape in that the way it's looked at locally, and look and trying to use supplies locally and not just a reliance on supplies that are outside that local jurisdiction. And I think, you know, that's some of the challenges that Arizona has faced.
I agree. I think, you know, every aquifer is different. Every water supply is different. Every community is different. Growth patterns are different. But I will say, I don't know enough about their scenario specifically to know what they got wrong if they did. But as I mentioned, the planning evolves and it's a constant evolution. We certainly are surprised by even what we came up with in 2017. There are different assumptions that change literally daily, certainly annually. And you learn on a constant basis. That's why you have to be vigilant about the planning process. So evolution and adaptation is absolutely key to any plan. And whatever we send or the city of Bernie decides to do, ultimately, it's going to come right back to Mike Mann to say what happens next year and is this working? And 5 years from now, do we need yet another supply, or do we need to look at some other variation? So.
Well, and by the way, the reason I asked that question, and maybe the regional planning helps address it, is just because there's this sense that the state, is obsessed with sort of the Texas miracle. Grow, 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 grow. Look, aren't we great and big? And we'll just keep growing. Is kind of the assumption. And water is a limiting factor potentially. And where does that limit need to be set so that we're not all high and dry in the end, like Arizona could become if this persists? So that's the question. And it's not something we can solve here, but it is something that we need to be cognizant of and not be caught with, oh, whoops, sorry, we messed up,
So our recommendation then would be to engage in these studies and to look at these things and to add these into the evaluation.
Right.
And I think Mike does some of this, but I'm interested to get his comments on it.
I apologize. I'm just standing up to tell you I have to leave. If you need anything from me, please feel free to call, but I have to go take care of something. My apologies.
Thank you, Mike.
Where they can evaluate their current studies, look at what studies need to be entered into, hire appropriate consultants.
Is there,
Give those consultants because you can hire all the consultants you want, but you got to give them some guidance as to what your goal is, right? So you need to steer them. We want to look at these things and we want to look at these contingencies and maybe help set those triggers and direct the consultant to help do those triggers. And it's always an ongoing. Like I said, Mike's probably doing some of that already, but
one question, is there a set of best practices out there or somebody establishing what best practices are? Because kind of routine review in terms of frequency of review, items to review, characteristics to consider. I mean, is there somebody that's doing that so that you can say, here are the best practices and you'll point to them, or somebody that's leading in that area?
I think the state planning cycle kind of sets a general pattern to some of the reoccurrence of these things, because all the water user groups, the city we want them, they have to look at some of that stuff already on a reoccurring basis just to interact with the state planning. Just like the groundwater district has to prepare a report that sends to the state planning level. So you're doing that on a 5 acre. So now what do we need to do locally to look a little bit more granular, like more specific at our needs versus that at the state level or even the regional level, it's, you're looking at big things. We want to look at a little bit more detailed, to take that same schedule at a detailed level of what Bernie and these communities need.
Right, and I'm probably not articulating this well, but when I say best practices, there's the macro level, the micro level that we're going to be more interested in. There's that laundry list of, okay, here are the items that ought to be on your routine research, review, analysis for this planning purpose, not just going dry to record. Okay, is it better to be looking at the safety or some other variation on that thing? If so, how do you make sure you're hitting the factors that the best minds that are working on this are looking at, so that we can say, hey, these people are doing it right, or the best we think it can be done, or this is the place to go look for that, so that you don't have to go reinvent the wheel and hope you're getting it right.
Let me, I guess, try to, because you have two different answers. I think you're kind of leading into. Number one is, what project do we want? And that has its own analysis and a whole lot of just things. And then after you've chosen a project and started that process and gotten it online, then you have to have another laundry list of things that you look at on an annual year, and an annual basis to make sure that it's meeting your expectations. And do we need something different? Do we need to make a change? So I think you have to look at it in both different deals. I think what we're focused on now, certainly the city council is focused on now, is first of all, do we need a supply? If so, what supply do we approach? Again, I'll bring up our process. What we did ultimately that led to Vista Ridge was, again, a lot of people came in 2010 and said, hey, come buy our project. We got the best project in the world. We took all of those and put a group together internally, both the political side, the permitting side, the water quality side. We had about 10 different experts within SAWS to run down that laundry list of things. We could certainly get what our analysis was and our criteria were, to ultimately what you kind of expand out what you've got here. Each project has these pros and cons. And then compare them 1 to 1. And ultimately that led down, we narrowed it down to 2 or 3 projects and ultimately chose one and negotiated with even Vista Ridge to even at the end, we didn't fully like it. We said you need to make some other changes. So I think that would be the process. The city council would need to say, let's put probably an expert panel together to give us the exact pros and cons of these things in very detailed manner. And then we can make a decision.
Sure. Yeah, and I appreciate that. What I'm trying to ask and not articulating well is how do we determine what our worst case scenario is at any given baseline? Right. And so how does a public servant, a politician know that the right criteria is being evaluated, right? Just because you hire HCR or any other third party, how do you check their homework and make sure, well, you did or didn't check this, or you're using the 1950s baseline as opposed to something that probably ought to be adjusted for more modern information, right? So are there best practices out there? Because it continues to grow. I've heard you guys repeatedly say that, we've changed the way we look at things. We've changed the math, right? We realize that we should be looking at things in a different way. And where do we tell the political leaders to go look to make sure that they can say, okay, are the best practices of determining what our worst case scenario are being followed? So as that continues to develop over time, we have a sense of how it moves. Because it will probably get worse as we know more information, things typically do. And so you have to be able to account for it. And so is there a greater gap than we originally expected? Not just on the prime indicators that we see out there, population growth, density, different technology uses, that sort of things. Talking more on the industry professional side and the historical data side and how you incorporate that in. And so probably yet again inarticulately stated what I'm looking for. But for a lay person to say, oh, this is where I go to find best practices. You guys have a staff of experts. You guys have a staff of experts, pros in the field. We have Mike who has many hats. Okay. And outside of hiring some third party, how do you check their homework? How do you know they're doing what they should be doing? And we can get a result we can rely on.
It's tough and it costs money. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially asking for is you're wanting to look at your existing supplies and how those supplies are holding up to their modeled assumptions. And how are you verifying in real time or historically looking at what has occurred and whether that model verification. So essentially they're developing a model for your water supply for your existing sources. And how do you field verify that model? And how do you periodically check that verification of that model that they're developing for groundwater, for surface water?
I like that. And then how do you take that as we know as it trends and say, okay, what if it stopped raining?
So the what if is, if that model is showing that maybe you should be using different inputs or it needs to be corrected to match the results. What the difference then is that it changes your trigger points for when you need to develop something different, whether it's tighter restrictions sooner or additional water supplies. But I mean, I think that's something that's a discussion you're going to have with the technical experts of how they're developing the model, what assumptions that they're using, and how do you verify, how do you periodically go back and verify that model and update that model based on current conditions? I mean, we've had some single 1-year droughts that have been worse that maybe we weren't the same 10-year drought record of the 50s, but some single 1-year droughts. So how do you incorporate that in there? I mean, that is definitely a discussion you're going to have with consultants, and that's something you should be discussing with them in advance of selection of your consultant, of how that they would look at that and continue to evaluate that with you. I mean, that's something I think you're going to have to take up. It's going to take time, it's going to take money, and that needs to be part of your selection process of who you choose.
That's helpful. In terms of the interview process, is what I hear you saying is let's get the smartest guys and gals in different areas and let them compete by explaining what they're going to do and how that impact can be analyzed so that you can make the best choice. And that makes sense.
What I'm saying, you might have more than one consultant like Saul was doing. You might have another consultant even come in and look at what the first consultant did just because of their differences in experience. one consultant, not that they're competing or correcting each other, but they're just helping each other because they've got a different background, different experience. They bring a new view to it and say, okay, well, y'all didn't look at this. Y'all should consider maybe looking at this too.
Like a peer review.
Or you leverage, you can all leverage knowledge and talent within the community. I mean, there's no, people within the community like this committee, but you have people that look over those reports and give feedback within the community. There's a lot of knowledge within the community that's untapped as well. That could offer other suggestions for what your consultants are looking at.
That's helpful. Thank you. All right, any other thoughts on that topic? The third topic listed was groundwater. Enhancing what we already have, Cow Creek, maybe reaching outside to other sources that we haven't talked about.
Right, and we threw this in here for that very reason, Patrick, but if we're gonna be talking about water, we have to have at least spoken about groundwater. It's a big component of what's being done here. If the ultimate decision is, or let's just say the recommendation from the committee is, yeah, we think there's some opportunity to improve supply through groundwater. Or inversely, we say, we think that we don't need to rely on that anymore. That's the recommendation to council. Whichever one it lines out to be with, or even both. Here's the reasons, good reasons why, and here's the reasons why. Why and why not on those two things. I think it has to be talked about, and we're remiss in our charge if we don't talk about it. Now, having said that, the last two that I listed on there were the Marble Falls and the Ellenberger San Salva aquifers, which are present in the subsurface in the Paleozoic, and they're not utilized, except I think there might be one well in all of Kendall County that utilizes that water. And we're on the down dip portion of that from a geologic standpoint. I've thought for a long time that whether it be the city or the county or the groundwater district, that it warrants some science and time be put into understanding that. Understanding if that is a potential future source, because it's not in conflict with anything else that's being done from a groundwater standpoint. Now, accessing that can be very expensive because it's at great depth. And but I think that in terms of long-term planning, I would really like to see that be a recommendation.
Well, I mean, agreed, it's at a greater depth, but it's a lot less piping to run than it is from the coast.
Yeah.
So my question is we kind of have a sense of what we have in terms of our existing wells. And this is, maybe Mike could have answered this if he was here, but maybe you guys know better. What have we done to assess the availability of additional wells that could be drilled for groundwater in Cow Creek? And is that a reasonable possibility?
Well, I mean, we just did a study last year. We did with James Beach and did some work. We're going to do more of that this year. And we've currently partnering with the county to look at additional monitoring wells. And part of that's to shore up some of these questions, like some of these other aquifers, and looking for opportunities. So in a recommendation to the city would be, hey, there might be some opportunity to be involved with some of that work that's being done. The city may not have to carry all that, but we can't carry it all as a groundwater district, but there may be opportunities for us to partner and share some of that. And as we look at these other aquifers and answer some of those questions about what is the available groundwater, and we're moving towards probably looking at some regionalization. I'd say regionalization, but I don't know what word to use.
Collaborative.
No, but like, we're in a priority groundwater district. We have the ability to look at different areas within the county and say, like, here's
Geologic areas.
yeah, we have different geologic conditions over here, and we can bifurcate our rules to have different, but we'll do in the science to look at what an area can really sustain. Like, and there'd be different sustainable levels for different areas of the county. And so we're gonna, that's probably some of the next research we're gonna be working on.
Yeah, that seems, frankly, explain to me why it's not some of the lowest hanging fruit out there for alternate source.
Well, I agree. I think
it's local. It's what we're already pulling out of the ground, more or less. chemically and using and we're accustomed to. And we're not bringing it across any kind of borders.
And to the city credit, the way they manage their groundwater withdrawals is on a seasonal basis. So during the summertime, they greatly reduce pumpage because they know that there's some, that it potentially affects other folks. Now, in a normal meteorological cycle, that model works really well. But in an extended deal where, low volumes at Canyon and low volumes at Bernie City Lake, leaning on if there's curtailment of those supplies, and now you're automatically have to invert that model. And you have to rely on groundwater more to meet basic, needs. So I think it'd be really good to understand that. And look at how the city's managing it. Jeff's very familiar with how that's been done historically. And there was no regulatory reason to do it. It was the good neighbor policy, for lack of a better phrase, in the city of Bernie saying, hey, this is part of a shared resource. And we choose to manage it this way to be good neighbors to those around us. So you may want to elaborate on that.
That's Mike's map that he likes to show. And right, it showed that the GBRA water was going to be our baseline. And it's steady flow anyway, so it makes sense to do that, but it would be cheaper for the city, to your point, to start with the well water first and go from there. So that's been the city's policy. I don't imagine that would change at all in the future, but and to Mike's earlier point, it's the peak that's the problem. So if we could just use what we need for humans, we probably could turn on the GBRA water and be done for years to come, but that's not the way it is right now. So I just wanted to add to something to what was said a while ago. The triggers, I think, is absolutely key. And just as the city had to re-examine what a real winter storm looks like 2 years ago, when you get one that hasn't happened ever, as far as anybody can tell, I think that's the kind of stress test that the city's current policies need on conservation, and whether, to John Kite's point, would they be effective or not? How would we even administer them? I mean, you need a water patrol to go out there and monitor that we've never done before. So I think the group's discussion on that is right on point with what the city can do without engaging in millions of dollars worth of studies or other consultants. That might need to happen too, and probably should. As far as new sources and picking the one that's the best, long-term best from financial and firm or viability standpoint. But I am hearing some things that I'm taking notes on that the city can do as a staff, and since I don't work there anymore, easy for me to say, but that we would have done, and that hasn't been done to my knowledge for a few years, and that's to examine effectiveness under some of this new modeling that we don't have to go far to see. We can copy what GBRA and SAWS are doing, like small cities usually do, and try to emulate that the best we can without taking years to do it or costing a lot of money or taking time that Mike doesn't have. I mean, he is one person deep, so that's been very good. But yeah, back to the original question, Tommy, yes, that's been the city's policy, is to use GBRA as the base and then the wells. And of course, now we use reclaimed water as a fourth curve there to try to mitigate the peaks altogether.
So I'm just finding myself reflecting on what Mike was saying kind of toward the, I think, tail end of his discussion. He said, basically the city has plenty of water for its current citizens, current use. That one of the biggest factors in, I guess, seeking more water is not only to supply more regional development, I suppose, more city growth, but also to supply landscaping, irrigation. And I sit there and I go, wow, are we really looking at, again, I'm sorry to harp on this, but an expensive water supply essentially so that we can also keep watering grass? And I find myself thinking that's got to be factored into the cost here, the cost benefit analysis. So
What escalating rates have started to address that over the years, and even more so every time the city has changed its water rates lately, it's the higher above normal user that's paying a much bigger price. Mike alluded to it as one of the ways to conserve is to charge a lot of money and make that group of persons using that much extraordinary use of water help pay for the next source, whatever it is, or for better conservation, whatever that is. And so that is certainly one method, but that's to my point too, Ben, is I'm thinking, how effective would the city's conservation measures be if you had to turn them on and they really had to work? Because we've never faced that. We've never had to cut back on our Canyon Lake water, not since we've hooked up to it in 20-something years. We certainly have had to comply with Cow Creek restrictions as the droughts have worsened. And of course, our own wells, we have to comply with what they'll do. And if they stop producing, they stop producing. So again, comparing it to that winter storm, we have, to my knowledge, the city hasn't done that. We haven't said, okay, here's Armageddon for 3 years. What does that look like and how effective would the city be in meeting that? So.
That's a crucial point. I think to Mr. Kite's point is crucial. What's our worst case scenario and what's our plan for it?
Right.
And whether there's a political argument on how much water you get and in terms of sustaining growth and all that sort of thing. But if something drastic happens, then we certainly should have made a plan to have an alternate water source and an ability to, if not switch it on, put it in place with some haste, right? And if we're not doing that now, then that's a pretty shoddy group of work.
Well, I mean, so going back to that question about the groundwater, obviously that's, we need hydrogeologic studies. That is not in our purview as a district. We're supposed to manage the limited supply of the known water sources, let's put it that way.
What about as it relates to the alternate, the Ellenberger and the Marble Falls? Is that available information that we can go get from somebody else? Do we need to enlist a third party to interact with those folks? How do we get that information?
There's not a lot, because as Tommy said, there's nobody really using them. We know they're down there from the geology, but nobody's really using those aquifers. And so you'd have to, the best way to get the data is actually put a well down there, put a monitoring well and do some testing on it. I think long-term, I mean, that's what the district's hoping to do with the county is actually do some of that, put some of those wells in and do some monitoring on those aquifers and start establishing some data on them so that you can actually see if they're viable, make a plan with them.
Any sense of what putting in a couple monitoring wells, something like that would cost? Just back the envelope.
Well, I was gonna say that when we were talking about this, you were talking about how you would have to really find a vein on the Ellenberger, I guess, that's high productive,
It's
right?
typically, fracture and joint controlled. So in other words, we think of the Cow Creek where it's predominantly the porosity of the stone and the permeability of the water in the stone, almost not like a sponge, but very similar to a sponge. In this case with Ellenberger and Marble Falls, there's preferential flow paths that are fractures of the natural joining pattern in the rock, where you tend to get the greatest yield out of a well in those. So I think there would have to be, you can do a shotgun approach, and those holes are difficult to drill, or you should probably do some geophysics and let the science try to guide you to where you might want to go. Now, there were seismic surveys done in Kendall County that I'm aware of twice in my lifetime. So in the 70s, early to mid 70s, and in the early 1980s, there were seismic surveys done across the county by oil and gas entities. That might give you some good indication of some of that subsurface structure if one could find that data. Otherwise, you're going to pick a targeted area, you're going to do the best science you can from a structural standpoint. You're going to do some geophysics, deep looking. We're looking down a couple thousand feet to do that. You look at some of the old oil and gas records from some of the wells that were drilled in the far western portion of the county for the Railroad Commission. When I was on the groundwater district, we did some of this. We started on it. We just touched the tip of it. That's been 15 years ago, maybe. So there's some information.
We're already one of the few districts that considers the Ellenberger to be relevant, which means we asked the Texas Water Development Board to actually run models on the limited data we have to produce what some available groundwater is there. The other districts around us don't do that. I think they're going to. There's been talk at the GMA of the other districts doing the same thing we've been doing for I guess, a couple cycles now. So
Is there any sense of what sort of volume is in place on there?
I think right now the model is, on the Ellenberger is not a whole lot, but there was not a whole lot of data put into that model. Right?
You mean volume in terms of acre feet or volume in terms of
There's a number.
the yield of a well?
Well,
Yes.
I would say acre feet, but that may not be the right question, so I'll take both answers.
I think
You
you.
won't get the second,
uh,
you won't get the second answer until,
Until you
won't
get,
this-
until you
don't-
get,
won't
until you
get
dig
the
in, right, I guess.
There are wells in that unit and, you know, elsewhere in the hill country and the Marble Falls and Ellenberger in particular, that are high production wells, 500 to 1,000 gallons a minute. So those are high production wells. That's equal to or greater than the size of any of the wells that the city of Bernie currently has. So, you know, it doesn't take, to get 1,000 acre feet of water across an expansive area does not take a very thick layer of water to do that. So I think with optimism and the appropriate amount of cynicism as well, that is definitely worth the science and the time to do it. And Cow Creek's a perfect place for that to be the point of the spear on that. But I think from a city standpoint, there's value in, you know, partnering that effort and understanding that.
Well, and yeah, it was, so do we have any sense of what the geophysical research would cost? I mean, you're saying maybe we can find some free data. Is that gonna be modernized,
Nothing's free.
high, well, we're at this, that's true, but you know, high definition data, or is that gonna be?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna cost you, it's not cheap.
Okay.
So, no,
Well,
but they're drilling that pilot hole for that monitor well isn't either, you know,
So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, or millions of dollars.
hundreds of thousands of dollars or more before you're all said and done.
Okay, and is that to learn where you think you should drill or to,
No, I think that you can get some of that done and put that pilot hole down for several $100,000. It's gonna cost you several $100,000 before it's said and done. Just find somebody to drill that hole that deep. Yeah, you guys have wells that are 2,000, 2,500 foot deep. There aren't a lot of water well drillers that prefer to drill that deep any
Right.
longer, so.
we're putting some monitoring wells down in the south, and this is in the Carrizo Aquifer, so an entirely different type of an aquifer and different porosity and all that, but they're going for a whole lot more. It used to be about 40,000. Now it's, you know, upwards of 80,000 to put in a monitor well, a couple 100 feet, and you're talking how deep could
It's 1,800 to 2,000 feet.
yeah, and so more rock and all of that, so it's.
Yeah, it depends on where you drill. You drill here, or you drill in the northern part of the county. You know, it's much shallower. It's gonna be shallower there than it is here. So.
But the monitoring well will give you some information, but it really is gonna give you more information, because you're gonna need to know the flow patterns and all those things that you talked about. You won't get a lot of that out of the monitor well itself. And so some of the porosity of that aquifer, I don't know anything about that aquifer and how it works, so. And what data is already out there, but even hiring a hydrologist just to, you know, James Beach or somebody of that nature that knows at least something about it, might give you a first sort of, is this something worth exploring or not? And maybe it's kind of a step into it, you know, spend $20,000 to say, should we spend another 40,000? And, you know, and you may end up down this rabbit hole and you spend a couple 100,000 saying, you know, this isn't worth it. Or you may get there and say, look, you know, we got there first and here we go. We got a great, perfect answer. But I think there are some steps that you can take to get you down. Ultimately, before you're ready to say, let's drill a well, you're probably going to be into the lower millions. You're certainly into the high 100,000s. You're probably going to put a monitor well there. We had, again, the desal project. Nobody was pumping down there. And so now we had an extra benefit. We knew there was a whole lot of water down there, but we didn't understand how the aquifer was going to react. We had some models and we put together some models, but once you get in there and you actually put in production wells, you're going to learn about a bunch of things about how it reacts a little bit different than what your models said, because you don't have the pumping. So. Fun.
other thoughts or information we ought to consider on that aspect of things? All right,
Maybe, how about this, Patrick? Yeah, we have it as a recommendation and if our two Cow Creek and board members on the committee willing to, keep the city informed as you progress on that, what the scope of that might look like. And where there might be a nice entry point for the city as a partner in that conversation. Or ask the city to designate someone to be in that conversation with you right now. So,
That sounds good. Also, I'll reach out to Dr. Mace and just see if he happens to know of any rogue data sets.
and you might talk to, Ron Green, right?
No, I don't.
Formerly with Southwest Research.
Yeah.
He's on the, Ron's a geologist and geophysicist, and that's the foremost geophysical group in this part of the world. I don't want to just say nation, this part of the world. They do some phenomenal work. And Ron may know something there, so. Okay. If you don't, we can always reach out to him collectively.
Sounds good.
Other regional utilities. This ties in a lot with the prior discussion about interconnectivity.
Agreed.
So unless there's some other thoughts on that, I'll let it sit. And then surface water. Tommy, the paper that you and Kurt provided talked about picking up surface water rights out of Guadalupe and the San Antonio River and maybe parlaying those into something with other folks. Certainly an interesting idea. I mean, we have some here in the county, we have some, you buy them anywhere, right? I mean, they're just, if somebody's selling it and it doesn't make good financial sense.
Exactly. And there's lots of people looking at that. I mean, Daryl would tell you, they're looking at it.
Always.
They're looking at it too, but I think it's an important strategic piece. How that plays out, it would be, to me, the evolution of this would be to say, hey, if we did have a program, an active program and funds set aside to acquire surface water rights, how do we monetize that and create value for the city? So do we create value in that it's held in some conservation form that has some residual value? Is it something you can then make a deal with GBRA to modify, supply from Canyon because you can move that point further down? Or in the San Antonio River Basin, does it have, it flows, which is, a big portion of the county, it flows on down ultimately to the coast and rejoins GBRA, but at a different point. So do we want to have a program to do that? Do we want to have that conversation to see if there's a way to do anything like that? I don't know if it held in conservation is of some value to GBRA for the HCP, which is, if there's some way to do that, but I think that ought to be a discussion that occurs. And it may be that it's not worth the venture or the energy, but let's at least get those ideas out, create an arena for those ideas to either be run with or shot down. So
I think you should always evaluate any opportunity for any of the surface water rights and evaluate, what the seniority of it is, what the use of it is. Could it be something that could be exchanged for something else? Or is it something you can hold and market some point down the road? Something you can use, but should always evaluate it whenever those opportunities present itself.
Okay. Other thoughts? All right, that's all I have on the agenda. Any other things we got to be talking about or that ought to be mentioned at this point?
Back to the previous, what do you, the summary, what's the idea? What are you planning to do with the summary?
So the summary was just a listing. When we got together last time, we talked about potential sources, right? And so what it did was take notes on what folks had to say about the pros and cons of those, so we can put that in what we plan to give to city council. So they have a sense of, okay, here are opportunities, here are some positives, here are some negatives. And these are broad strokes. There will be more to it, but it was just one last opportunity for the group to collectively look at it and say, hey, we should have mentioned this, or this is a good idea or a bad idea for this, or maybe some additional thought needs to be added because we've reached a point where it's time to start putting pen to paper. And it's better not to go and second guess something in a month month or two when we have it down and say, well, you really should have thought about this. So
So it would be interesting to be able to compare the costs of these different sources. Right now, you've got some costs in here, and I don't know how we put.
a lot of
how we
it's
get
just
that.
guessing.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
that's expensive, or, oh, that's less expensive. We think.
Just could be helpful to know. Yeah, and other things that this is non sequitur to that question, so we maybe come back to that question, but is also, I've been, talking to Mr. Cartridge, who's on the committee, couldn't be here today, but about education of the students through BISD. And I recognize we're advising the city, but there still could be a pass through to recommend some pointed curriculum recommendations, let's put it that way. So that the kids are starting to wake up to the realities of a limited water supply. Sorry, it's not sequitur. And
That's
then,
probably a good discussion point for the conservation side of things, having an overarching
yeah,
program that touches various aspects of the community.
yeah. So also, we were talking about land stewardship, but I think he and I need to put our heads together about what we might throw your all's way for consideration. But I'm sorry, I interrupted your question.
Well, just, like, for example, you've got SAW desal, the desal part is not really, it wouldn't be desal, it would be likely more Edwards water if it were an option up here.
Okay, well, that was a question, because what I recalled when you presented was you're talking about if you were going to sell wholesale water and at some time in the future, it would probably come from your desal facility, because that's where if you're going to have a surplus of some kind, or wholesale, that's where it might come from. So that was my understanding. So if that's incorrect, it's a good time to correct it.
Well, again, there's source and then there's distribution. The distribution is set up so that, again, right now it would be Canyon Lake water. When that goes away, that would be mostly Edwards unless we plumb in a different source. We will be bringing a lot more water from the H2 Oaks plant, which includes desal, but it's desal and our ASR project and our local Carrizo project. That'll be coming up the west side. So that water will get mixed in there. But the desal, the actual formal desal water would
It's just a source.
it'll be a source and it'll be such a tiny source. And I can't imagine even very few drops would ever make it into Bernie through when I follow that model up to Bernie through our distributions.
Thanks for clarifying that. I misunderstood. So
Also on the number 7, you got direct potable reuse. And we talked a lot about potable reuse. The word indirect reuse has a connotation in the water world that you're putting it in and taking it out somewhere for some other use. What's not really discussed here is some of the reuse water for irrigation purposes and or other purposes, rather to shave off some of that peak rather than just for potable.
Well, there's says increased reclamation for irrigation use. That's number 4. Is that address that question or not?
The top of page.
It's snuck by you.
it's kind of.
Oh, there it is.
Last-
It did sneak by me here.
Last
Okay.
pages.
Sorry, I missed that.
Well, but also along those lines, there's the potential, if you were to say, hey, someday we'll close the loop and we're gonna do some sort of reuse. You could still run a line up and do indirect and run through, again, a constructed wetland or something that just adds that extra level of biofiltration, removes some of that
Yeah, this was here.
undesirable stuff.
This was here in light of Bernie Lake. What if we used it as our
I mean, like-
surface water and added capacity and changed the nature of our permit with the state, and it is a potential source. Is it a good idea? There was some discussion on it, so that's why I'm here.
Sorry, I just missed it. I'm not very good at reading.
But again,
I'm from Georgia, so English isn't my first language.
but again, it's an indirect reuse, but for human consumption. But then the question is, how can we polish it so that it's not just, I know Dallas does a lot of, treatment plants dumping right into reservoirs and they just suck it out on the other end of the reservoir, on the other side of the little jetty they put in there. That water is kind of gross to me, and it's not something I'd want to try to sell to the public, and also I wouldn't want to foul up Bernie City Lake with it. On the other hand, if it could be properly
My take on that was that it was such a low return on investment, and and the hurdles were so high that it was probably not worth a lot of pursuit at this point. But we would be remiss if we didn't at least point it out and say, this is an existing possibility. Here are the problems.
Yeah.
You know, if
Well, I'm-
not here, potential.
I'm differentiating it from direct potable reuse though. It's called indirect potable reuse. And it's,
And don't disagree, they're both.
it's
they're
low
both
tech.
hurdles.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
didn't want to leave either of them off the list. So they say, well, haven't you heard of those? Right, and so that we at least check the box and say, yes, we considered this. Here are the issues that we saw with it. And if you want, you know, to go down that path, then great, tell us what you want, but I wouldn't want to spend a ton of intellectual capital on it if it's not in the top.
Yeah, I guess,
handful of options.
again, we have to differentiate independent, I'm sorry. Indirect potable from direct potable because you're taking out that technology piece that was very expensive. And instead you're really just focusing on a pipeline that runs water. up to
Well,
the-
in my appreciation, at least as we discussed it, was that would be polished water of some sort.
Yeah.
Right, it may not be fully potable, but it would
Well,
definitely.
it may not be like
It would be
reverse
more like what we put in
osmosis.
the creek now.
Yeah, with maybe just a little constructed wetland filtration system. Just a thought. Yeah, it's low tech and it's lower cost, but we still have to factor in concerns regarding, yeah. we have
It was just,
to figure it out.
the concerns were state permitting, location, recapture, all the other things that go into that, right? So
Right.
nobody got very excited about it, so I didn't give a lot of air. If that's changed, let me know. I'm going to change.
I think it could be worth looking at. Just the question is how effective are those wetlands at removing those contaminants? That's really, and then how much space would it take to do an effective biofiltration? And then what's the evaporative loss in that equation too? Looked at it in the past, frankly, so.
Well, the A&M's done some great studies on that, particularly down along the borderlands. Using biofiltration systems and constructed wetlands for final polishing of wastewater going into the Rio Grande. So there's some science out there we can look at and chase down some cost numbers.
It could be a step toward DPR. Just as a thought.
One outside Dallas, I forget what it's called.
Just, yeah.
North Texas has a few.
Yeah, there's the North Texas, what is the utility where they're pulling water out of the Trinity? They're filtering it and then they're pumping it back up into Lake Ray Hubbard. It goes in pretty stinky, it comes out pretty nice, so. But I haven't looked at the studies on what it's removing. So I know that's being done.
Next steps?
Probably put some writing together and at least an outline form circulated to the group for comment. Some of you may be tasked with putting the meat on the bones of those various parts. Since I'm the layperson among the group. But I can at least start with an outline and get that ball rolling.
I would offer if you put an outline up on, you know,
Google Docs or something.
Google Docs or OneDrive, then we could all sign into it and edit the same one document and focus on a part, or just whenever we have time, do a piece of it.
Right. Similar to what we did with the conservation.
Yep.
In the end, one person will need to go through the whole document and rewrite it. So it reads, it's written in, you know, the.
I'm familiar with that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it'll have to read like somebody actually wrote it on
It
purpose.
doesn't read like an amalgamation.
All right, other thoughts? Nope. Thanks for everyone's time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Easy stuff.